J.W. Rodgers, not dead, war prisoner.
Here's your death message. Everyone reported missing in action.
Stacy.
There is your
Joseph.
You've seen the old V-mail letters.
Oh, yeah.
I got back up and enrolled in the university, and I was in the student union, and looked up there on the memorial board they had for those killed in action, and there was my name up there on that board. I said that I better get that taken off, or I might not ever get a degree from here. For my benefit of my kids and grandkids, I made tapes as I was traveling down the road in the car, just about my experience in being shot down and captured, and some of the experiences in PWI there. That is not quite complete. I have a couple of the tapes finished, but I'm on the third one, and it's not quite through. We just haven't really edited it that fully yet. But she wanted me to do it so she could put it down on the computer and run off copies for the kids or something like that.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
And then the Hughes County Historical Society has been after me to give to prepare a history of my family for the Hughes County Historical Society. My family here in Hughes County, they were old pioneers in the county. They're trying to get all the older families kind of documented in what they did, and then they go back and cross-check one against the other when they're looking for history and work it out.
Okay, today is July 14th, 1987. My name is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with James W. Rodgers, Jr. in Holdenville, Oklahoma. No, my last check. Mr. Rodgers, where were you born?
I was born in Holdenville on September the 30th, 1917.
1917. Who was your father?
James W. Rodgers, Sr. My mother was Tasca Powell Rodgers.
Tasca Powell.
T-A-S-K-A.
And where were your parents from?
My father was from southwest Missouri, and my mother originally was from Kentucky, Winchester, Kentucky.
Did they ever say why their families moved to
came because her father just wanted to come out here and pioneer, and they moved here in 1903 from Kentucky. My mother's mother had passed away, and her father had married again, and they bought some farmland here and settled in right near Holdenville. In fact, we still own the place that they originally bought.
Now, did they buy the land before or after statehood?
It was before statehood. My mother came here in 1903. My father was working with the Interior Department with the Indians. He was a United States Indian agent and field clerk at that time, and was sent here out of the Muskogee office to look after the Creeks and Seminoles. And he studied law during the time he was working for the government, and was admitted to the bar in 1912. And he still stayed with the government until about World War I, and then went out on his own practicing law after World War I.
Was he a lawyer with the Indian Service?
He was a lawyer at the time he was with the Indian Service, but not when he started with them.
Yeah.
He came here in 1909 and received his law degree in 1912. That was the year that he married my mother.
From University of Oklahoma?
No, it was his law degree was from the University of Chicago, but it was the work was done mostly by correspondence.
Did your mother's family have to get permission to enter Indian territory?
No. The town of Holdenville had already been platted and settled to a great extent at the time she moved here, and their place was bought from the Indians. When an Indian who had allotted land died, they could sell through the court, sell their land, and it had been bought from the Indians directly.
Because I was going to ask about, purchasing land before statehood from the Indians. Do you know if any of your grandparents or great-grandparents was involved in the Civil War?
Yes, my great-grandfather on my father's side was involved in the Civil War, and to what extent, I really don't know. I just heard the stories of him being, I think he was fought for the Confederacy.
What was his name?
Let's see, my grandfather's name was Jesse. I can't tell you that right now, but I've got the history written down. My dad made a little genealogical sketch for me and took the family way back. I believe it was William Green Rodgers. That's the best I can remember.
Okay. Could you give a description of Holdenville from a child's point of view?
From the south point of view?
From a child's point of view.
Oh, from a child's point of view.
What did the town look like?
Well, it was rather a progressive town. See, from a child's point of view, and I'm talking from the standpoint of the 1920s. Going to school. My parents lived at the edge of in this same plot that we own, a 40-acre tract of land that we own, which was about a mile out of town at that time. So when I became old enough to go to school, they moved into a house which we bought in on North Hinckley Street in Holdenville, 400 block, and there was only 2 houses on the block at that time, and it was the main thoroughfare into town from the rural area, and was at that time federal highways were just getting platted through the country, and was on a federal highway, which was 270, US 270. And I walked. Like I say, my parents moved in town so I could be where I could be within walking distance of school. Walked to school, which was just about 5 blocks from my home, and went to Central Grade School here in Holdenville, and then went to high school and junior high, which was combined at the Holdenville High School, which was just 2 blocks from my home. And when I went into junior high school, the year I went into junior high school, the high school burned down. And very vivid recollections of that time. And for a while we were going to school in church basements and things like that. But the town at that time was a sort of a boom town, with the oil business booming and the Seminole oil fields being developed. And everybody was seemed to be prosperous, and my father was at a point where he was buying a farm here and a tract of land here and mineral rights here, and he had mortgaged one to buy the next one, and he got caught in the Depression in 1929 when he had overextended himself, and being a lawyer, you didn't have a regular income. Your clients paid you off in the Depression with chickens and eggs and hams and this, that, and the other, just like they used to in the doctors when they didn't have any money to pay you. So he lost nearly everything he had in the Depression. And I graduated from high school in 1934, and my sister had graduated in 1931 from Holdenville High School.
Let me ask, could you describe the change in Holdenville before the oil boom and during the oil boom? How did the oil boom affect the town?
Oh, it was a very, very progressive town during the oil boom, and then after the Depression hit. See, we had in 1930 in the census here in Holdenville, we had peaked out at about 7,500, a little more than 7,500 people in Holdenville, and we had approximately, I'd say, 28,000 people in the county. And after that, the people migrated out, and we became a very, very conservative community. And I'll tell you how it affects a small town like this. The generation of the wildcatters and the liberals that go out and the doers that went broke during the Depression left their mark on their children, who went through all of this, and they became very cautious and conservative from the start. And those that were able to survive and stay here were the people that had the money to begin with, primarily. It wasn't true in my family's case, because my father was a Republican, and he's just conservative all the way, and he never accumulated any wealth to speak of. He just had a good living, and but those families that were in the oil business, and there were the wildcatters, some of their children stayed in the oil business, but they wouldn't wildcat. They would go put a deal together, and they'd maybe keep a little bit of it and sell the rest of it out, and in a conservative manner. And most of those people that made their money, their children lived off of that money for and didn't do anything towards making the town more progressive. Didn't. They had it. and it's sort of like anybody that once they accumulate wealth, if there's any great change, they might lose their wealth. And so consequently, they were very conservative. And then those people, the grandchildren of those wildcatters, saw that you had to be progressive. You had to get out and do these things, and they didn't see any hope for any success in a small town like this, and they left. So all we had left here in the community were the conservative elements, and anyone who was really progressive would be a person that had to move in here for some reason or another.
When did the oil boom begin in Holdenville?
Well, it was going on in the early 20s, in 1922 and 23. Of course, I don't remember it that well myself, but from examining abstracts and of course in my business, I find all of this activity going on. And we had, in Holdenville, we had some of the most progressive, back in the early days, citizens. We had J.A. Chapman, who became one of the wealthiest persons in the world, and left here and went to Tulsa. He discovered the Glen Pool up at Tulsa, and was a major stockholder in Mobil Oil Corporation, and he has yet 4 ranches around Holdenville. He loved the land.
And wasn't C.R. Anthony from Holdenville?
Who? Yes, C.R. Anthony was raised in the area between Holdenville and Wewoka. My mother knew him as Ross. They were old high school friends or something. And then this Rodgers, John Rodgers, that was with Chapman all of his life, he came from Holdenville. McFarland, who was the father-in-law of Jim Chapman, and Bob R.B. McFarland. Maybe you know the McFarland Memorial Church in Norman. He was the one that built that for them. And you look at the aldermen in the old original council, and you find a bunch of these. V.V. Harris in Oklahoma City, one of the wealthiest people in Oklahoma City for a time, was originally from Holdenville. S.J. Sarkis, the Sarkis Foundation, was from Holdenville. Got his start trading in Indian land, buying mineral rights in this area. And just people like that are scattered out all over. The background, I don't know. They found out that they had to move where the action was, and they moved to the big city.
I'd like to ask, was there a Holden family here? The town named after?
As the history tells us, I think he was an agent for the Rock Island Railroad. Now, I might be wrong about this. Back in the 1890s, just about the time of the settlement here, and it was named after him. G.W. McShann was an old pioneer, and that is the story I think that he related. His family still owns lots of the downtown area in Holdenville. But what I was trying to say, those people were so progressive. To give you an example, they built a bridge across the South Canadian River through the funds of the city of Holdenville in order to get the farmers across that river into Holdenville and to trade in the city. Then later on, we built one of the larger lakes at that time in the state of Oklahoma for our own water supply, and it's still down there, and we still use it. It's been adequate for everything that we need all these years, but they were really progressive in their thinking.
What time period was the bridge?
Around, that was before 1920 when the bridge was built. It washed out in 1937 in a flood, I think, or heavy rainfall, and it took us years to get the state to replace it. And now, you know, after having built the dam there, and the road goes across, the highway goes across the dam for the city lake, to show you how we've become dependent upon the state and federal government to do these things for us. We find that the dam is leaking a little bit, and we go to the state, say, hey, your road, the dam over which your road goes is leaking, and you better fix it. Instead of us trying to do the fixing ourselves, you know.
So after your father lost most everything in the Depression, how did the family get by?
Well, actually, we had very little. I can remember my evening meal would be mush and milk. Many times we just glad to have that. Everyone was working, trying to help whatever way they could, and I would work after school and on Saturdays at the grocery store. I worked from 6 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night and made $1.50. And just proud to have that, you know. And we didn't have, my dad didn't have money to send me through college. He helped me my first year in college, and I worked the rest of the way. And he just couldn't afford it. And I remember one year I enrolled at OU, and I had 10 cents in my pocket when I went through the line to enroll. And this was in the heart of, about 1937, I think, in the heart of the Depression. And when I got through enrolling, they said, you pay here. And I said, well, I don't have any money. They said, well, in that case, you go through here. There was a lot of people that didn't have the money, and we went in there and signed a note for it ourselves, and I went down to the campus corner and got a job working for by the hour, and went to the union cafeteria and got a job for my meals, and the lady that I stayed with let me work for my room, and it was 9 weeks into the semester before I had enough money to buy all my books.
And this is in 37?
37, yes.
What year did you graduate from the University of Oklahoma?
Well, I graduated after the war. I had 120 hours before the war, but I didn't have a degree at that time. So after the war, you could get a combined degree through the university at that time, and I didn't know really whether I wanted to be whether I wanted to study enough. You know, after the war, I went in and talked to the dean of the law school, and he said, well, maybe you ought to go another semester in arts and science school just to see whether you can adapt to it, and if you do, fine. And I went to the semester and made above B average, I guess, in there, and he said, well, that's fine, you'll make it all right. And I went through the law school there just straight through in a little over 2 years.
What was your major when you entered?
In government, English.
And would you give me your reflections on Pearl Harbor Day?
Oh yeah, I can remember it very, very clearly. It was, I guess, after or during church that I found out about it. You know, we didn't realize at that time the complete significance, but I was in 1941. See, I was 20 4 years old. And I realized that we were in a war, and that our whole lives were going to be changed one way or the other. And I had been, there's a lot of history before this, you know. The draft was going on before the war, before Pearl Harbor. In 1940, I had dropped out of college without receiving my degree because I didn't think my majors were going to do me any good, and I was just trying to find out what I wanted to do primarily. I went out to California, went to work for a J.C. Penney store out there in Oxnard, California. And while I was out there, it came time to register for the draft, so I registered from Holdenville, Oklahoma, so that if I was drafted, I'd go with the people I was raised with. And I was the first one drafted in the first group that was drafted. There were 3 of us left from Holdenville on, it was about seemed like it was about the 2nd or 3rd of February in 1941. That's before Pearl Harbor, in December the 7th, 1941. And the American Legion threw us a big party the night before, and being the first group drafted, and we were taken by train up to Oklahoma City, and where we stayed all night and then had our physical the next morning. And this being the last civilian day, we went out and partied. The group of us partied the night before, and we really hung one on. It was quite a party. I was in no physical shape to take a physical the next morning, and I went through it. I never had any problems with my health in any way, and when I got through, they told me that I had a heart murmur, and that I was classified as 4F. And I thought, well, great goodness. It couldn't be anything but that party just caused my heart to act up a little bit. And they said it could be caused by bad tonsils. Maybe I ought to go home and have my tonsils out, and they'd call me later on for examination. And it wasn't until 1943 then that I was called back. I didn't go down and try to volunteer because it couldn't pass the draft, a physical for the draft. You surely couldn't pass one for the Marines or the Navy. And I went to work up in the Oklahoma Ordnance Works in Pryor, Oklahoma, during that period of time. And
what were your duties up there?
I was working in the payroll department. I was the assistant director of the payroll division, and we worked with addressograph, multigraph machines, the forerunners of the so-called computers now.
What were they making in Pryor? What?
Ordnance materials, firepower. It was tremendous. There must have been 30,000 people hired up there.
Now, were they making the complete projectile, or?
Yes. As I recall, of course, I had very little to do with what went on out in the field, but they were out scattered all over a wide area of these things. It was the DuPont in charge of it. They were the owner of the plant. And it was all done on a cost-plus basis, as I recall. And they had 3 or 4 plants, and they were worked in connection with one in Washington State, I know. Maybe they were making the same material, or one was shipping part of it to the other side. I just never was familiar with exactly how that worked. But in February of 1943, I was called back in, and they asked me what branch of the service I'd like to go into, and I said, well, field artillery. I didn't ever think I could pass a flying physical if I hadn't been able to pass one of these others. I would love to have been a flying cadet, or and been a pilot. But they said, well, they needed him in the Air Force, so I was assigned to Shepherd Field, and got my training from there, and passed the flying physical with flying colors, so to speak.
Tell me about your basic training at Shepherd.
Basic training at Shepherd was real. Well, it wasn't really tough at all. We had our 10-mile hikes and this, that, and the other, but I pretty soon learned the ways of how to get around in the Army, and got a job as a messenger for one of the groups there, and I had a bicycle that I could ride back and forth across the compound, and I had very little KP duty or anything else to do because I had kind of a plush job there.
So you went into a pilot?
They put me on flying status, and decided that I would make a good radio man, and first I was sent to Harlingen, from there to gunnery school, Harlingen Army Gunnery School, and we did aerial gunnery work. That was the finest duty I ever had in the service. It was fun, really. I enjoyed it.
What did you do there?
We learned how to fire. First of all, they taught you just like you were in a shooting gallery with a little old BB gun, knocking things off a shelf. Then they got you up to the 22, and then they taught you. It was we had our 12-gauge shotguns, and we'd shoot skeet. First we started with trap shooting, and so that that's just what any kid would like to do, and we went into skeet shooting, and then the biggest challenge of all after that was shooting skeet from a mobile base. Have you ever tried anything like that? They got a quarter-mile track and put you on the back end of a flatbed truck with your shotgun, and there are 24 houses stationed around that quarter-mile track. When the truck hits the electric eye, it sets the skeet comes out. You don't know whether it's coming at you this way, going that way, or that way, and you have to adjust and track it from there. And it's a challenge. I was tickled to death to hit 8 out of the 24 there on the round. But then they put you with the machine guns, and you had a Jeep going around the track. It was, this side of the track was 300 yards from you, and the other side was 500. And you try to put as many shells into that sleeve that Jeep was pulling as possible. And then you went airborne, and we did, I don't know how many missions, but I'd never flown in a small plane even, and we were in the back end of an 86, I guess it was 86 or something, 86, and had a machine gun on a mount there, and there'd be an airplane pulling a sleeve down away from you there, and each of my shells had a certain color on it, and when we would fire it through there, you just count the number of holes in the sleeve with your color on it, and grade you accordingly. But it was fun. I never enjoyed anything more in my life.
How long were you there?
About 6 weeks.
6 weeks. And from there?
I went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to take my radio training. At which time I applied for pilot training, and by the time I had finished there, which was about 6 months after that, we finished. Let's see. We left radio school. It was That's 1st of December, and we're shipped to Salt Lake City for reassignment, and we were assigned to overseas training in Colorado Springs at Peterson Field. And that was on Christmas Day when we got into Colorado Springs. And we trained there for, through March and into April. And our crew then was put together in Colorado Springs, a 10-man crew. And we picked up a new plane in early part of April in Topeka, Kansas, and flew from there to West Palm Beach and took the southern route, flying to Trinidad and on down to Fortaleza and Belém, Brazil, Fortaleza and Natal. We went across, and we didn't have to stop at Ascension Island. Went right from there to Dakar, West Africa.
So you flew to Africa?
You flew over there, and then on up to Oran, and then Oran and Marrakesh up in French Morocco, on over to Algiers and Tunis, and on over into our eventual base at Manduria, Italy.
Manduria, Italy.
It was a small town there in the heel of the boot of Italy, and we were with the 450th Bomb Group there.
Now, were you a radio operator?
A radio operator.
Okay. Would you describe basically your duty as the operator on the 17?
On B-24.
B-24. B-24 has the two
Had
tails?
twin fins.
Twin fins, okay, that's right.
Well, my duty was to maintain contact with the base at all times. After going into combat, though, they had only a lead radio operator, and they only had a lead bomber. I don't know why they had to have bombers and radio operators on all the planes, except maybe in an emergency you get lost and away from the group or something. But we bombed pattern bombing off the lead bomber and the radio
What's
operator.
pattern bombing?
Well, you fly in a formation, and when the lead bomber drops his bombs, you're in a formation, and everybody else are just toggleiers. They just push the button and drop their bombs at the same time, so the bombs will fall pattern which you were flying. See, and it gives them a pretty good spread over the area. So as compared with the English, individually, every plane coming in from a different direction. I don't know how in the world they kept from losing more planes than they did, but that was their approach to it. And I've being a prisoner of war, I've been through a few of the bombings myself, and I know I've seen a lot of them, seen how they operated, and I think ours was the most effective way of handling it.
Did you maintain contact between the planes and the formation?
We had radio silence practically all on every mission from the start. See, we would form over the Adriatic. The Adriatic is a large enough sea that when you get up 20,000 feet in the air, you can see Bulgaria over on one side and Italy over on the other. And you're in between two nations that are hostile to you. And we would form every day in the middle of it, and then head north, nobody knowing who was watching us, know exactly where we're going, because we always went in the same direction. And we veered off either to the east or to the west if we were going to bomb northern Italy, or if we going to the east, well, we'd go into, my first mission was to Ploesti, the oil fields and refineries there in Romania. It's not the Ploesti raid, which was a low-level bombing raid, but my first mission was to Ploesti, and we bombed it at 20,000 feet.
What was the date of that mission?
It was, see, we got in there on the first day of May, 1944, and I would say it had to be around the 3rd of May. I was on my 9th mission, 8th and 9th. They gave you, if you went far enough into enemy territory and we had missions that were 10, 11 hours, they would give you credit for 2 missions, and we had to have 50 missions down there in the 15th Air Force before we could come back. In the 8th Air Force, all you had to have was 25.
Who in the formation had the order of where they were going?
Well, they were all briefed at the briefing in the morning as to where they were going and what the primary target would be and what the secondary target would be. Radio men didn't attend those briefings, but the officers, the bombardiers and the navigators and the pilot and co-pilot attended those briefings, and that we knew to start where we were going. So did the enemy. It was amazing. We on the day that I was shot down, Axis Sally came on radio and said, "Hello, you men of the 450th. We hope you have a pleasant flight today. We're going to be ready for you. And as you go over Neustadt," and they already had the message there. Oh, their intelligence was great. I'll tell you, they knew. And as a prisoner of war, I could tell them nothing when I went through their intelligence. There wasn't anything new. And they told me this. I mean, it wasn't me thinking it. But see, I was shot down on May the 24th, and I was shot through the leg. My leg was broken, and I had to be taken to a hospital. And the closest hospital was in Stalag 17B in Krems, Austria. There, we were between, where I was shot down was between, pretty close to St. Pölten, Austria. And so they took me up to this prison hospital in Krems.
Would you describe the mission you were shot down on? What happened when you were shot down?
Our mission, to start off with, I have to lay a little groundwork because it'll later explain why I was reported killed in action and instead of missing in action. And we go out on the back end of a Jeep, the whole crew does, and we pick up our parachutes and take them into the plane. On this particular mission, I don't know how it happened, but our parachute has stamped on it the individual's name. And I accidentally got a hold of Lieutenant Chetwood's parachute. Had my own harness on. Got a hold of his parachute, and he got mine when we grabbed him off the Jeep there. And we neither one knew it. I realized this, but Our mission was to Wiener Neustadt, which is just outside of Vienna. Neustadt means new city of Vienna. And there was an ME-109 factory supposed to be there, and we were to bomb this. Well, during the mission, we of course went up the Adriatic and then veered off to the east, and we were approximately 11 o'clock. We were off course, and to the west of our course, some few hundred miles approximately, I guess, and we encountered flak over the city of Graz, Austria, which is in the southern part of Austria. And we were hit by this flak, and we were flying tail end Charlie, or lower left number 7, I believe it would be called. And as a result of this flak hitting us, I don't know whether we had engine trouble or what, but we were trailing back some little bit behind the group. Then we ran into a force of ME-109s and FW-170s.
What's the 109?
It's a Messerschmitt, and the FW is a Focke-Wulf. And they are German fighter planes, the two best fighters they had. And they attacked us from the front, coming at us. I figured, it looked to me like they were about 5 across and 5 down, and they just put a wall of fire coming through your formation. All guns firing, and they flew by you, through you, and they knocked off the nose of our plane somewhere or other. I don't know whether I never learned whether the flak was what got the nose of our plane, but in that encounter, the co-pilot and the bombardier and the navigator and the nose gunner were all killed. They would come back then past the group, turn around and come at us from the rear and attack us from the rear. And I was flying waist gunner, and they would hide behind the tail fin. You know, when I'm firing at the rear, we have no cutoffs on our machine guns to keep us from firing into our own tail fins. So we had to be awfully careful about catching the planes that are coming in from the outside. And we had a formula. You know, when a plane was attacking, he is formulating a track that comes right in, consistent with the speed of the plane forward. And we would put up fire, knowing that in order to make that arc, he had to come through that area, and if he did, we'd hit him. We had enough rounds going out that way. So those planes would hide behind that tail fin, and about 3 of them get in a little circle. One would come in, and as soon as he'd go on by, we'd have to look for the next one to come in, because if a plane didn't have his nose pointed towards you, he wasn't a threat to you, and you just were concerned with the ones that were coming in at you. And so you would then pick up the next one coming in, and you'd give him the lead according to your training and everything, and put up your wall of fire for him to come through. And I think I was able to get one plane because his nose went up, and then he started down in a spin, and could have been a diversion for me to keep watching down there so the others could come on in and fire, but I don't think it was. But I couldn't follow him all the way down to get a clear-cut claim on one. But then the next one that comes in, he lets go. It must be a 20 millimeter shell that explodes in the back end section of our plane, and a lot of smoke in there. And I feel a numbness in my leg, and I'm still holding on to spade grips of the plane, and I keep on firing as the next plane or two comes in, and then all of a sudden there's evidently the electrical system was out, and I never heard a bailout or anything, or no warning. But the plane went into a flat spin. Well, I didn't have on my parachute. I just had on my harness, standing on a flak suit, and I had a flak suit on, and I had to get rid of my heated suit, undo my heated suit cord, undo my throat mic, undo my earphones and headsets, and had to get all these things while the plane is going down in a flat spin, and it threw me over, fortunately, on my face, and I fell right over top of my parachute. And all I had to do was pull myself up, push myself up, and it had me pinned to the floor for a while there, and I couldn't get up. Finally hit a pocket of air or something, and I was able to push up and just snap on this parachute and turn over. I thought I had everything undone, unhitched, and I turn over and crawl to the escape hatch, which was back behind me about 4 to 6 feet, I'd say, in the floor. And by that time, everybody else in the plane was gone, except the tail gunner, who was standing back behind on the other side of the escape hatch, waiting for me to get out. And when I got to almost to the escape hatch, just crawling on my stomach, I felt something tugging. I thought I had my injured leg tangled up in that. There's a coil of cable there that is for the you hook onto the injured gunner and let it pull his ripcord for him when you throw him out of the plane. And come to find out later on, I had forgotten to undo my heated suit cord, and I was just lucky enough that when I bailed out, pulled my ripcord, it snapped that heated suit cord right there at my foot on the left. And then, of course, I pulled my ripcord. My whole worry was about hitting the ground, tearing up the leg. It was already broken. And I don't know how high we were, but we were still pretty high. But as I floated down, the situation went from where there was nothing but just machine gun fire and blasting and just real hell there, to that absolute deathly silence. There's nothing, no wind, because you don't hear the wind blowing. It's not blowing against anything, and it's just absolute deathly silence. And I looked, kind of surveyed the territory down there, and all I could see was trees. I thought, well, that's good. And then all those trees disappeared in the course of just a few minutes, it seemed like. And I began to maneuver my parachute a little bit, and fortunately, I saw a cabin down there on the side of the mountain, and I was able to loop my parachute over the top of a tall pine tree, and I just took a small jerk, and I was swinging right up against the body of this pine tree, and there wasn't another limb clear down to the ground from where I was.
How far?
It must have been 10 or 15 feet below me. And all I had to do was reach out and grab the tree. Meanwhile, though, on the way down, or while I was up in tree one, I was able to, we had a first aid kit up here on our parachute harness. I was able to open that up and get a little morphine out and shoot myself with through my suit with a little morphine to kind of kill the pain. And anyhow, I pulled myself up just a little bit and loosened the parachute harness and slipped out of it. And with 2 arms and 1 leg hanging around the tree, I was able to easily let myself down to the ground. But when I got to the ground, I was sitting on my buttocks. And I found out that right there how I could have just been killed if I had fallen that way on the floor of the plane, because I could not lift my right leg over my left leg. It would just only lift up as far as the brake, and just couldn't lift it lift the bottom part of it over the left leg to get on my knees and crawl. I thought, well, I'll just lift my right leg and my left leg over my right leg, but my foot was laying out there, and as I turned into it, the foot would twist into the brake there, and there's no way I could stand that pain there. So I just was able to just lay over on my back and rest for a little while, and it wasn't more than five minutes. Okay, we'll take up. It seems that when I was explaining that I had just sat down and was sitting there, and I leaned back and laid down and tried to rest a little bit because of all of the exhaustion and through this all. And I looked over my head, and there was this house down in the valley. And S2 had always told us that if we'd go and look for a friendly face, we could generally inland find a friendly face that would help us out. And I didn't know but what I might be bleeding to death with the bullet wound in the leg there. And so I decided that I would try to crawl down to that house and get some help. And the only thing I could do was to sort of give a backstroke and crawl with my elbows and my hands and push myself backward down the side of that hill towards this house. Well, I had thought that I had been working for 30 minutes and I ought to be a good ways down the way, and all of a sudden I heard somebody say, "Halt, halt," and I immediately put my hands up in the air, and they came. I looked back over my head, and I was looking down the barrel of a German rifle. It looked like about a number 2 wash tub as I looked down it, and he yelled "Pistola." Of course, I understood what he was talking about, and I shook my head no, I didn't have one. And then he yelled the word "kaput, kaput," and I didn't know that much German. I didn't know what he was talking about. He kept pointing at my leg and saying "kaput, kaput," and I figured I better guess that it meant, is it bad or something like that, and I said yes, and they got up, and by that time they had 4 or 5 little German boys. They were about, I'd say 13, 14 years old, that had gathered in around the area, and there were just 2 Germans with guns. See, you got to understand that we're way inland there, and they had never been bombed in that area by the Americans or the English. We were about the snow line, or it was watery, and it was the 24th of May, and just kind of damp where we came down there. In the, I would have called it the Bavarian Alps, probably, but these 2 German guards got the little boys together, and they were trying to make a pack saddle to carry me down the side of the hill, or the mountain, and they couldn't do that, so they got 2 poles and put some wooden pieces across the two poles and just made a stretcher for me, and 4 little boys then carried me down the side of the mountain. And an interesting sidelight from that was this little blonde-headed boy, must have been 14 years old, on my right. When he'd catch the German guard not looking, he'd pat me on the shoulder and smile at me and give me a nod like I'm your friend. And they carried me into this little beer tavern in the mountains there, and I was on exhibition there for the rest of the day. They pulled my boot off, which was fleece lined. It was an English flying boot, and I was shot just above where the boot came to in the leg, and it seemed that blood poured out of that fleece lined boot when they took it off. Well, that meant I'd bled quite a little bit, but I think what happened was that in the cold temperature up there, that the wound clotted over rather fast. And they, from time to time that they gave me from other flyers, other prisoners, medical kits, they gave me, am I getting out of focus? Gave me some additional morphine to keep down the pain. I didn't really, the S2 had always told us not to take anything to drink. They wanted to give me some schnapps. And I said no, and many times after that I wish I had taken them up on the deal. But I didn't have anything to eat or drink from 11 o'clock from the time I left the base until that night about 11 o'clock. Well, let's get a little bit ahead of the story, but from there, after dark, the German trucks came by, and there'd been several planes shot down in the area. And incidentally, to go back to why I was reported killed in action and how the mix-up in the parachutes confused all of this, while I was hanging in that tree, and before I got down to the ground, there was a loud crash, and that was our plane crashing into the ground someplace nearby, not necessarily nearby, because I never saw any of the members of our crew that survived after that date. And they found in the wreckage of the plane the parachute with my name on it. So they reported me missing, me killed in action, being one of the bodies there in the plane. They found this parachute that I came down with in the tree, and it had Lieutenant Chetwood's name on it. And consequently, they carried him as missing in action for a year until he was finally reported killed. And the timing also of the telegrams that my folks received here, they received on about D-Day, I believe, around June the 6th. They received the first telegram saying that I was missing in action. And then somewhere around the 1st of July, 1st to the 4th of July, having been previously reported missing in action, I was now reported killed. That was when the message got through from the Red Cross, through the German intelligence of that crash and the parachute being found in the wreckage of the plane. And I had never been interrogated by the Dulag Luft, the interrogation center there in Frankfurt, Germany at that time. And I stayed in the PW camp there at Krems until I was able to travel, which was July the 7th. And at that time we were shipped back to Frankfurt to go through the interrogation center. There's a lieutenant and I that were shot down on the same mission. He was shot through the arm, and I was shot through the leg, and I was on crutches, and he his arm was in a big cast out there.
Now, were you in the hospital?
I was in the hospital area there, and I have a little story, if you've got a little time here, which I call a little learning is a dangerous thing. I'd had 10 hours of French in college before I went into the service, and I could pick up a little of the French, and the doctors there in our PW camp were prisoners. One of them was a Polish doctor who spoke 7 different languages, and the other was a French doctor who spoke 5 different languages, and they conversed back and forth in French. Well, all of the medical supplies were in short supply in the hospital there, but they put my leg in a cast, and it was clear up to my thigh, and fleas would get down inside my cast and bite there, and I'd have to figure out a way. I'd pull it away, and I remembered from bathing my dog that the fleas didn't like water very much, and I'd pour water down top of that cast and kill those fleas out and keep them from biting me. But every time when the doctors would look at my leg, and it had a window cut in the side of it, of the cast there, to where they could treat the wound, and they'd shake their head and say, "We're going to have to take it off." And that's all I could pick up from their conversation. So one day I was outside. It was summertime, and I was outside laying on the ground. My crutches right there by me, and the medical orderly came up and said, "The doctors want to see you." And I said, "What do they want?" And he said, "Well, they're going to take it off." And that's all I could get out of him. And so I began preparing my defense. You know, I'd lay there at night, and I could smell the wounds of these other fellows around in that same room there that were infected, and it was just terrible. But mine seemed to be doing all right. And I said to the doctor, I said, "Doctor, is my wound infected?" "No, not infected. We just don't like the way it's doing." And I said, "Well, I can't understand why you're going to take my leg off just because you don't like the way it's doing." He says, "Oh, no, not your leg, the cast." So a little learning is really a dangerous thing. But anyhow, they put on a new cast. They were, what was wrong, it was a little crooked in the cast. And they put on a new cast, and it took up nearly all of the plaster of Paris that they had left in the camp. And then it still didn't suit them. But they didn't have enough because it was crooked in the cast, and they didn't have enough plaster of Paris to put a new cast on. So they did one of the, they tell me in medical circles that it's just amazing, this kind of an operation. They took, made a point on my cast there, in about the middle of it, on the front and the back, and then they sawed out a little V shape just halfway around on the outside of it, and just took that little chip out of the cast, put me over on my side, and I was laying on a table here on my side with my leg stretched out, and they got a man on top of there with no sedation whatsoever, and he started jumping on up and down on my leg and the cast, trying to break that cast and to break the leg at the same time. Well, I didn't have any brace under the top of the cast, and it was giving at the hip up here. And I yelled and screamed at them, and finally got them to put some books underneath the top of the cast. And they came down with one big jump then, and thing just snapped out and closed up. They took a little piece of plaster of Paris and patched it up and closed it and looked at it through the oh, I don't know, the X-ray or whatever they had, and it was straightened out. And so far to this day, I have my right leg is 5/8 of an inch shorter than my left leg, but it's not enough to even give me a limp. Kind of gives me trouble with my spine being out of line a little bit and get sinus trouble and things like that. But I think it's a marvelous. It was just the way they handled it. Were able to handle it the way, and take care of it. But anyhow, that left me on crutches when they were taking me back to the WWII in Frankfurt. There was 2 Feldwebels. That's the.
Where were you in the hospital?
This was at Stalag 17B in Krems, in the prisoner of war hospital.
How were you treated there?
And I was treated very nicely. It was a very good camp, and I had good food, because I traded my A2 flying jacket for a little. It was contraband, wasn't supposed to be around, but a little electrical hot plate. Even electrical plugs in this hospital there, where you could plug in things, and I could trade through my American Red Cross parcels. I could trade with the Frenchmen who wandered around and had access to the kitchen, and I traded for brown beans and one time, and soaked them overnight in water, and then cooked them all morning. Bought a chunk of French sausage, bologna, to season it with, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, I had the best dish of beans you ever tasted. Really, but that was an exception, really. Red Cross parcels came to the. If you received a hospital parcel, you got a little different type than you got from the regular Red Cross parcel when you got them. And by that time, the Germans were getting pretty short on food too. And we didn't get our Red Cross parcels but about once every 2 weeks on the average. And that meant that a Red Cross parcel was supposed to last you for a week. If you spread it out, you could survive on that pretty well. But we didn't always get the Red Cross parcels. And anyhow, I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story. These 2 Feldwebels, the German sergeants, they were guards, who took us to Frankfurt. We had to go on one train to St. Pölten, Austria, where we caught the, what is it they call it? The express, that intercontinental train, goes from London clear across over to the Orient Express. The Orient Express. We caught that there at St. Pölten on into Frankfurt, but we had to stay overnight in St. Pölten in order to catch the train the next morning. There we were put in a prison camp with Russian prisoners of war. We did our best to make ourselves understood with them, and they were laboring out around anti-aircraft installations there in St. Pölten. And as we marched down the streets of St. Pölten one night, the Volkssturm, the People's Army, and all the soldiers, all smiles to us, even waving at us as we walked down the street and into this PW camp. And then at 11 o'clock the next day, the air raid sirens went on. And come to find out, they had never been hit by bombs in that area. That's why they were so friendly. There nothing wrong. And they had moved this factory that was in Wiener Neustadt, Semi-109 factory, down to the St. Poland area. There was an airstrip out there close by, and it was supposed to be hidden back in there. And the air raid sirens went off, and our guards were as anxious to get out of there as we were. So they grabbed us and took us. We hitched a ride on a half-track down to the air raid shelter, which was a 3/4 of a mile down the way underneath the airstrip. It was just kind of a cave that dug back in underneath the airstrip. And I was standing outside the air raid shelter with all this group of German soldiers, German women, children, and they were smiling and talking to us. And I was trying to tell them, you've never been bombed. You're not going to be bombed. And the first group went over. And the second group went over. You could see the planes coming up off the fields, and they'd go up. I saw one plane go up, and it got into a cloud bank, and you could hear the awfulest pounding of the machine gun fire. But he was in the clouds, just using up his bullets, and he came back down and lands again. You know, he didn't have to get involved in it. But anyhow, the third group had gone over, and I see there, they're not going to bomb you. And then all of a sudden, out of a clear blue sky comes a fourth group from down here. And you don't have to be told when the bomb bay doors open on it, even though they're up 20,000 feet. And the bombs start coming down, you can hear that. And it's coming down, and everybody started making a run for the air raid shelter. And I had leaned on my crutches in this marshy area, and my crutches were bogged down in the area, and I was the last one into the air raid shelter. Totally dark in there, and these bombs start hitting all around us, and the screaming and the yelling, all that's going on in there. It's just a wonder that somebody hadn't knifed us in the back, 2 Americans and all those Germans in there. But I was standing just about in the doorway. There's probably the strongest point in the whole area. But when we got out, the atmosphere was completely different. The old German Volkssturm member, you know, he's a guy who was probably a veteran of World War I or maybe even older. That the Home Guard, and they had nothing but hatred in their eyes for us. And bombs all around. They had really torn that place up. But the attitude, what I'm trying to say, of the people was altogether different. And we went from there on in through the little town, headquarters area, and there was a little beer tavern where the Germans had been singing German songs the night before as we came through. And that building had been completely demolished. And just like in a movie, you'd see a flag that had been standing in one corner, had fallen over to the other corner, and from the second floor, and was draping down onto the first floor, a big swastika hanging down there, just like a scene in a movie. And anyhow, we went back from there and on into Frankfurt. When we got off the train in Frankfurt, the guards, the Feltway, were guarding us, put their machine guns on the crowd, not on us, and let us walk through the streets to the place we were going. But that's how the situation was. Frankfurt had been bombed that much that they had all that hatred for the American people, you see. And from there we went on to Wetzlar and West Germany. But let me tell you just a little bit about the interrogation there by the Germans. They put me in solitary confinement first. Then a major comes in and he says, Sergeant Rodgers said, "You're old news to us." He knew I gave him my name, rank, and serial number. He said, "Your bomb group down there, 450th, said, you wouldn't know, but said they've got a new runway down there. You don't have to take off on one of those steel mat runways anymore and wonder which bump you're going to get airborne on. Said, you've got a new concrete runway down there." And he said, "You wouldn't know about that because you've been a prisoner that long." And I said, "You're old news. You can't tell us anything." That's how much they knew about what was going on down there around our camp. And so I wasn't there but about 2 or 3 days, I guess. And they put us on a train to Wetzlar. And I don't know why, maybe that was for dispersal, but this was west of Frankfurt. Then we went on another freight train east to across the outskirts of Berlin and across to Stettin and northeast into Pomerania, to a place called Keep Haida. And this was Stalag Luft 4. It was west of the free city of Danzig, a certain amount, about halfway between Stettin and the free city of Danzig. And it's all that's in Poland now, part of Poland. It's all in Russian.
Now, Danzig is like a dance?
Dansk is what the current name for it is. Dansk, D-A-N-S-K.
Okay.
And we stayed there. See, I got there in, I guess, early part latter part of July.
44?
Of 44. Right after I got there, they moved the camp. It was Stalag Luft 6, which had been at a place on farther east called what was the name of that town? Heidekreuk. And these prisoners were transferred by boat in a hold of a boat down there and then run all the way from the port where they landed, someplace there pretty close to our camp. They were run and jabbed with bayonets, the Germans wanting to get the food off the backs of the knapsacks of the individuals and take it away from them. They were trying to get them to fall. If they did, they'd sick the dogs on them and get their food away from them. But I saw one fella come in with 125 bayonet wounds up and down his back, and they were treating him on the inside of our camp. That he'd been one of those stragglers, I guess. But you know, when a man's got a gun at your back, if you want to smart off and give him trouble, you can make it hard on yourself. If you just keep your mouth shut and hold your feelings to yourself and don't yell and spout off anything, you can get along a whole lot better. And I learned that pretty quick in there. But
did you travel on the 40 and 8s on the railroad?
On a 40 and 8 car, and there was about 50 or 51. I was in a 40 and 8 car. I was going across there, and I found out real early because the American fighters were bombing, were strafing these trains going through there, and they didn't know who had American prisoners of war on them or whatever. And we had that happen to us. We're in air raid alerts going down the track several times, but I had tied a blanket, made a hammock out of it, one of those horse rings, you know, that they had in there to another, and during the good times in the day, I'd lay up there in the hammock and get out of that crowd down on the floor. The minute they'd have an air raid alert, I'd get down in the middle of it with them. You know, kind of protect myself that much.
How crowded was it in those train cars?
It was so crowded that you could barely sit down with your knees up against you when all of you were there. At night, sometimes you'd be that way, and I've got some wild stories to tell about the times at night, and everybody have to relieve themselves, and they have a can that they pass back and forth in the dark and it spilled all over everybody. It was really pitiful, but it's laughable at this time, you know, how it all happened. But really, they'd let you out maybe once or twice a day during the day, because you weren't traveling all the time. They just couldn't get their trains through these tracks. And you see, I traveled on the trains from Krems to Frankfurt to Wetzlar, back across to Kiefheide, and then back down to Barth from Kiefheide. So I had pretty well covered the whole country of Germany during that time on 40 and 8. Every time on 40 and 8 cars.
Why did they move you around so much?
Well, that just when we left Stalag Luft 4 there in Kiefheide, it was in January of 45, and the Russians were about to cut us off up there. The rest of the camp, I was still in the hospital area, and the rest of the camp had to march out of there, and they were on the march during the latter part of January, all of February, until the war was over, constantly on the march during the day. And they'd camp out at night. Now, I don't know how in the world they survived that march, but I was put in into 40 and 8 car. All the hospital patients were, and we were shipped down. It took us 8 days to get from Stettin, from Kiefheide to Barth. 7 days to get to Stettin. It was a choke point there at Stettin, and then 1 day to get on up to Barth from there. But the Russians at night, while we were parked on our side tracks and no engine on our train, we could hear the fire, machine gun fire, and one particular night they said, if we don't have an engine hooked on here within the next hour, we're leaving you. And unfortunately, or whatever they did get an engine hooked up, and we were able to be transferred on over to Barth. But in Barth, I had just gotten into a poker game, and I don't smoke, and I'd won all the cigarettes in our compound practically. And it was, I was richest man in the whole compound insofar as cigarettes were money. You could buy food for money, for cigarettes. And I had enough food there stashed away that from other people's Red Cross parcels that I'd traded for, that I was set for the rest of the war. And 2 weeks after that, I was starving to death. When we had to transfer to Barth, why, they said you can only take what you can carry. And of course, cigarettes were easier to carry than food. And when I got to Barth, they didn't have any food down there. And I lost I got down to 95 pounds in the camp there at Barth. There's another story that goes along with this. A horse. They had the horses pulling the wagons around that cleaned out the latrines, you know, and a horse fell down in the snow and broke its leg outside our compound. And during this part of the this time when we were the hungriest. This horse broke its leg outside, and we were getting a dishwater soup, just a cup of it a day, plus 2 slices of black bread. And if we had any of our coffee left, we could heat up water and put our powdered coffee into it, and that's all we had to eat during the whole 24-hour period. And so the camp commander asked if they could bring that horse in and put it in our central cook shack and put it in our stew. And got permission to do that, and they butchered it. And the first time, now you got to understand that in each compound, there's 4 compounds in this camp, in this Stalag Luft 1. Each compound had approximately 2,500 men in the compound. There was 10 barracks to the compound. Each barracks had 10 rooms in them, and each room had 24 men to the room. Then they had a barracks leader's room, and had kept a few more people in there. But we had a very democratic organization. The barracks leaders, the room leaders, and the compound leader. And the leaders dealt with the Germans directly. And so when they had this, that's 1 horse for 2,500 men approximately. You can understand that. So when the soup was issued, it was a pretty doggone good stew for us. We just really loved that stew. And the next day, the bones were cooked over again, and it was still a little bit more tasteful, but the 3rd day was back down to nothing. So the 4th day, they had a bone issue. Now, the way they had this bone issue, they divide the stacks of bones into 10 stacks of bones for the 10 barracks. And the barracks leaders come in and they draw high cards to see who gets first choice of the bones. He takes his stack of bones back to the barracks, and he divides those bones into 10 pretty equal stacks. And the room leader comes in and he draws for high cards to see who gets the particular stack of bones. By the time it came down to our room, we had 24 men, and we had 3 bones there to chew on. And it was serious business, you know, the 24 men drawing for 3 bones. And the one old boy by the name of Bill Schafitzel from Springfield, Missouri, I never shall forget this story, drew the ace of spades and got this long, choice bone. It kind of makes my mouth water now to think about how good it looked at that time. And he would just tickle to death, and to hear this he was about 5'9", I guess, Bill was. And you know, stealing food was a cardinal sin in a place like that. And they just didn't do that. But this big old boy by the name of Ed Shea, he's about 6'2", and he kind of towered over Bill Schafitzel. But there was Bill. I'm standing over there about where you are, and Bill's here chewing on this bone like this, you know, and chewing on this end. This other end is floating free in the breeze, and here's Bill right behind him, and that bone wiggling in front of his mouth all the time, and I can see him looking down at Bill and looking out, looking at that bone, and he couldn't resist it any longer. He leaned over and clamped down on the other end of the bone, and Bill cuts out, you know. That's all needs to be said. Ed Jay took off. That was the end of that story. But just how people can get so much like dogs when they get in a similar situation.
What would you describe the barracks in
the barracks were, well, I think you could, if you have ever seen any of the barracks here in the United States of the prisoners of war, they're just long, narrow rough buildings. They had bunks 3 high, 3 deep, and scattered around so that there would be 24 men in each room.
How many rooms in the barracks?
And there was 10 rooms to the barracks.
So how long was this building?
And it's quite lengthy. And it would have toilets at the end, and they had what we called the V2 on this back end. It was a tank on the back on a wagon that these horses were pulling, and they would put down this rubber hose underneath the bathrooms there, latrines, and the guy that was operating the thing, it was ingenious. He would pump until he created a vacuum somewhere or other, and they put a match to something, alcohol or something up here, and it released it, and it caused an explosion, and that would suck all of the stuff up into the tank. But every time one of those things went off, boom, it's kind of like a bomb going off, everybody get jumpy. One morning, the Russians were always the ones that had to handle. The American flyers never did have to do any work, but the Russians did all of the latrine duty, and they were always laughing and smiling with us as they went by, and yak, and this, that, and the other. Never will forget this one morning, bright and early, but it was, in the spring of 45, and these Russians were kind of lighthearted, but the dew was on the ground, and we just barely getting up, and we heard this explosion, and looked out, we heard yak, looked out the window, and there's this Russian out there. He was wiping that stuff all off his face. The rubber hose had broken. And he's just covered with oh, wild.
Go ahead.
Well, that's just about all, except to tell you about when the war was just about over, in the latter part of April, we had found where, or somewhere or other, they had found where a Red Cross shipment had been stuck on a side railing somewhere or other, and we got a whole train car load of Red Cross parcels, and each man in camp got 2 Red Cross parcels, and they were just really, that was when we needed it most, because there wasn't any other food. The Germans were starving to death too at that time. They just didn't have anything, and I thought sometimes we were eating better maybe than they were. But anyhow, that was just before the Russians came in, and the Russians found some cattle and butchered them when they came in, but the funny thing about on May the 1st, when we were there by ourselves, we always had a radio. We had news every night.
I was going to ask if you had a radio.
Somewhere they had built a radio and put it inside the pocket of a GI coat somehow or other, and every time they'd come in to search the barracks, the guy would put on his coat, take off. And we had better news, because we'd read the German newspapers, we'd get the BBC broadcast, and somewhere in between the two of them, we'd know the lines, pretty well where the lines were. The Germans never would agree until 2 or 3 days, 4 or 5 days down the line, that the Americans had done what they said that they had done, and this, that, and the other. But anyhow, we had the BBC tuned in, and we knew what was going on the radio. We knew the Russians were getting pretty close to our camp, and we were staying in there pretty close. And just as the Russians were coming down the road, And I don't know whether you have watched Hogan's Heroes or not, but you know how they tunneled and did things like that. Well, we cut off pieces of wood off of the barracks. We'd pull the braces off, and anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, and cut it up and put it in for firewood there to keep warm in the wintertime. And some guys were standing on top of the barracks as the Russians were coming down the road, and they were yelling and cheering, and that barracks just folded, folded up. It was that bare, you know. But about that time, we got the hit parade on BBC. You know what the #1 tune on the hit parade was? Don't Fence Me In.
How were you treated there? The German guards, how'd they treat you?
German guards, some of them, at this camp, we didn't have any trouble with any of the guards. At Keith Haida, we had a guard we called Big Stoop, and another one we called Iron Cross, and those were the guards that the guys made sure were going to get it when the war was over. And I understood that somewhere along that march, both of them died. So, you know.
Now, were you on the march?
No, I wasn't on the march. See, I was put in the train and shipped down, but these others were marching from January on through till April. And towards the end of the war, they were getting, they tell me they were really getting jumpy, and the guys were still being as tough and as mean as ever. And I heard that they got them. I don't know.
Now, what camp were you in, the last one?
The last one was Stalag Luft 4. No, Stalag Luft 1. We came out 4 to 1. Right.
Where's 1 located?
That's at Bar.
At the bar.
Yes.
And 4 was at?
That's Keith Haida.
At Keith Haida.
I'm sure I'm right about that.
Any other particular incidents in prison camp, or?
Well, go a little further. You know how I mentioned how they flew us out and flew us back to Reims, France, and then on into Camp Lucky Strike and on home from there. But there were one particular incident around Christmas time, 1944. The American Red Cross had sent Christmas parcels, and we got our half parcel at Christmas. And each one contained a scene back home. And I know the American Red Cross never thought about this when they were including that scene back home, but it caused more men to go crazy. They just flipped their lid at that time. We call it hit the wire. You got a warning track here, and you run past that warning track towards the fence, which is about 10 yards away. You're dead game out there, and they can shoot at you. So you didn't want to do that. When they flipped their lid, they'd head to the wire. And it was just pretty sad time during that time. And the Germans, we were eating those parcels, and they made up excuses to come in and search your camp. And in the middle of the night, one time in there, they came in and cut up our mattresses, which were all straw mattresses, and put our food down in the middle of the floor, poured it out all in, and had the lights on, then turned the lights off and left us that way for the rest of the night. Everything all piled up in the middle of the floor. And we put on shows at Christmas time and New Year's.
Tell me about that.
Well, guys get together, and some of them had, there was a few musical instruments furnished by the YMCA, I believe, that sent some, well, this one guy had an accordion that he learned how to play while he was in the PW camp. And he furnished all of the instrumental music, and we'd have a chorus, our solos, and some guitars, and put on crazy acts, and just anything to raise the morale. And this particular chaplain, that was a minister of the Church of England, he saw the need to raise the morale of the people during this time. And, you know, everybody that was there, their last mission was a catastrophe of some sort, and they had a tale to tell. And there's some wild tales come out of that. You could hardly believe some of them, but yet you knew they could be true. There's a lot of truth to them. Like the one fellow who was in a B-24, a tail gunner, and he kept feeling his plane kind of swerve back and forth, and he thought, that's unusual. So that it must be something wrong. I better get out of here. And he opened the back door to his tail turret to get out, and there wasn't any plane there. He was just floating like a feather down in that portion of the plane. I don't know whether he was high enough that he pulled his parachute, he jumped out and pulled his parachute and left that, or whether he rode it on down. But I've heard similar stories that make me believe that it's possible, you know, and things like this. But this chaplain, he saw maybe the need for a little levity. Maybe this is true. But he said, by the way, he says, did I ever tell you about the time when I was captured on North Africa? No, Padre, tell us. Oh, he said, blimey, he said, it was rough. He said, you know, said the shells were blasting to the left of me, and I was in my shell hole here, and as one would hit to the left of me, I'd pray, and then a shell would blast to the right of me, and it just so happened I had a little sacramental wine, and I'd take a little nip of my sacramental wine, and a shell would blast to the left of me, and I'd pray, and to the right of me, and I'd dip on that wine. He says, you know, to this day, I can't really say which was doing me the most good. Just as serious as all.
Yeah. Would you tell me your average day in prison camp?
Average day?
Your average day, what you did every day?
We'd get up in the morning and have roll call.
What time?
It'd be, somewhere around 8:30 or 9 o'clock. Then we would, well, before that, we'd probably try to have a cup of coffee or something. Each one had to do it all individually. And the idea is the fellow that could save his food and could last the longest. You know, the chow hound, he wasn't going to survive. He ate up all his food in one day, and he'd starve the rest of the week, you know. And then we would be sort of necessary that you go out and get a little exercise. They wouldn't have any organized exercises for you, but exercise was to walk around the perimeters of the camp, inside the compound there. They'd have, within the guardrail there, just walk. You'd see them walking all day long around there. And we had cards. We could play bridge. In fact, I taught a bunch of the fellows in there to play bridge, and we'd have some real good bridge games before the year was over. We got to be pretty adept at our own system of bridge, and it's a wild game. But then there wasn't much to read, wasn't anything like that, but you were constantly figuring out. And this one guy in my room, Vincent Gregorich from Stockton, California, had the most interesting mind. He was just a born engineer. I wouldn't have thought it possible. But we did get the German newspapers in there into our room, and the guys that read German could interpret them for us, and we learned a lot of the German language that way too. But he built a blower stove. Now ordinarily we'd just put our can of water up on the stove and let it heat that water until it got hot enough for our coffee. Our cans were built out of the cans that came in the American Red Cross parcel. We'd flatten out and crimp the pieces together and make pans and make cups and this, that, and the other, whatever. But he contrived a little blower stove, which was about this wide, about this tall. It had an opening about a flue coming off the top about that big around. And in that top of that, he had holes for, well, orange juice cans, frozen orange juice cans. We had a pate can that was about the same size, and they'd sit down in that. There were 3 holes in that flue. Now on the top of it was a solid grate up here that we'd put our bread on and toast it there. But the heat, there's a grate here for the fuel, for the paper that we used for this blower stove. You could take 1 double page of a newspaper and boil these 3 cans of water and toast your toast with 1 double sheet of newspaper. Now isn't that making the maximum use out of your energy?
How did it work? Any idea?
I don't know, but all of it was concentrated up here, and then it went out this flue,
yeah.
And the water went all around. I mean, the heat went all around these cans that were sticking there in the flue, and it wasn't too much water inside each can, but it got the cans that hot that it did the job. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
A guy could do something like that.
And when were like that, or when was revolution? Not revolution, but retreat.
Well, retreat. We had a roll call again about according to the time of year, but generally 30 minutes to an hour before dark that they'd have a roll call. And we didn't have to in the hospital barracks there, which we were in. There was just 1 room in this barracks. I think it was a hospital area, and we didn't have to go out to roll call. We weren't forced to go out, but the guards would come in and count noses, and we had this little old guard, and we really liked him. He was always wanting to be friendly towards us, show us pictures of his children back home, and he was happy to be there. He was old enough to have been a World War I veteran. I don't know whether he was or not, but you know, you could tell how the war was going for the Germans by the age of the guards in the towers, and they got to be where they were old enough to be your grandfather, and they're pretty shaky on their trigger finger there, you know, in the towers there, and you just didn't want to fool with them. They were just shaking, and then the least little event would cause them to set off a burst of shells that your way.
Were you locked in the barracks at night?
And we were locked in the barracks at night, and the windows were shuttered, closed. No way of getting out at night or wandering around and outside at night.
What were your average meals in the prison camp?
Average meal during the good times were some kartoffels, potatoes.
Now, do you have breakfast?
They didn't serve us breakfast. We'd have bread. They'd give us a couple of slices of bread for breakfast. We had in coffee there from a Red Cross parcel. Of we'd do that. And in the morning, in good time, we got some barley. Sometimes it had worms in it, sometimes it didn't. But you just fished them out, and in the bad times, so there wasn't a dog or a cat that lived around our compound. And let me tell you that a cat looks just like a rabbit when it's dressed, and except for the tail. It's just, I mean, you won't think about those things, but you do a whole lot of things when you're hungry. And no, we wouldn't get a meal but twice a day at the best times. And the Red Cross parcel was supposed to do us for the rest of the time. We'd have, in a Red Cross parcel, we'd have a D-bar, a can of salmon. If you didn't have a can of salmon, you'd have a can of tuna fish. That was one of the better packages that you'd get. You'd get a can of Klim, K-L-I-M. It's milk spelled backwards, powdered milk. You'd have some K-ration crackers, almost like graham crackers, you know, and you'd have some margarine, a can of margarine. It was enough. It's supposed to last you for a week, a full ration of it. But let me tell you a story about how this one fella had saved up his rations, and he was going to have a cake. Of course, we had nothing to put in a cake to make it rise in any way. It was all just goo sitting there like a, well, might compare it to a brownie or something that if you cooked it, but it would be soggy in the middle. What this guy would do is more compared to, I guess you could compare it to Zwabot pie, chocolate Zwabot pie. We'd make one of these sheets, pans, out of these tin cans, and we'd grate our D-bar up into powder. Just grate it up and mix a little of this powdered milk with it, and water, and put it into this pan. Then make a thick, with the milk, make a thick cream topping to go over the top of it there. Oh, first of all, you'd grate up your crackers, your K-ration crackers, and put a little margarine in with them and shape the pan with that. Then put your chocolate in there, and then your cream on top of it there. Set it out in the snow and let it chill for a few hours, and bring it in. You got a delicious treat there. Well, this old boy.
What? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This old boy was in the barracks there, and he was just whistling. He had saved all of his rations there in order to fix this pie. And all of a sudden, he heard this V2 coming up the latrine machine there, and the horses were coming up, and just in time to look out the door and see the wagon run right over the top of his pie right out there in the snow, you know. He was sick.
What is a D-bar?
Chocolate bar, semi-sweet chocolate. That's the ration that the Army gave you there.
Also, I was going to ask, how did they build the radio?
They just, you know, you were able to bribe guards for a few things and get a few parts here and there, and maybe some of them had been able to get parts or bring parts off of their plane with them somewhere or other. Get parts to take in with them. Now,
was the camp all enlisted men?
Oh no, ours the Stalag Lups, which is the prison camp for airmen, had officers and enlisted men all there in the same camp.
And you say the Russians did all the work mainly?
Yeah. Well, no American airmen were, because they were all NCOs and officers. And you're not supposed to, under the Geneva Convention, you're not supposed to work an NCO or an officer. And now the Army privates, EFCs, I think, had to work out in the fields from what I could gather. But there had been times we'd been tickled to death to go out and work in some farmer's field and let him feed us there, you know, for working. We'd have loved that. But
Tell me about being liberated. What happened?
Well, I never will forget on when we were liberated and we flew back into this base there at Reims. I walked off that plane and I could smell a GI mess hall. I could smell that coffee just as plainly, and I just headed in that direction and found the mess hall open. And the cook was obviously aware that the PWs were coming in, and he had some hot bread there and some coffee that he fed us, and it was probably one of the better meals I ever had in my life. It was just great. We just, you know, you couldn't believe that would taste that good.
Now, you were liberated by the Russians?
We were liberated by the Russians.
Tell me about that.
Well, when they came in, this was on...
The German guards were gone?
The German guards were gone. They left at midnight on April the 30th. The Russians didn't get in there into our camp until about 9 or 10 o'clock that evening of May 1st. And they kept us there until, I think it was the 13th of May that we flew out of there. This was after the 8th of May, which was VE Day, you see. And we never did get back into our own country's hands until the 13th of May.
How were you treated by the Russians?
The Russians treated us fairly well. They, like I said before, they went out and rounded up some cattle and butchered them for us and tried to feed us as good as they could. We had a few Red Cross parcels left there in the camp, and survived on them for a while. In fact, there was a tragedy occurred in our camp there, an Englishman. When they got these two Red Cross parcels issued at the same time, he built himself one big cake out of everything that was in these two Red Cross parcels and ate it all. And it all clogged up in his stomach. And they took him in to operate on him. He died before they could get it taken care of. But there he was. The war was over. He had it whipped, and you know, just that you know, your stomach though shrinks up when you're in a situation like that. And it was, I got home on the 4th of July from overseas, and I couldn't eat a full meal for a month after that because my stomach hadn't. To backtrack just a little bit on that, my navigator that exchanged parachutes with me was from Bellingham, Washington, and he was reported missing in action for a year, and during that time his mother died of heart attack, I'm sure. My pilot, or co-pilot rather, lived in Sperry, Oklahoma, right outside Tulsa, and his mother died of heartbreak within a year. You know, the casualties of war are not always just those on the battlefield. And my pilot was Bert Baker, president of Commercial Bank over in Muskogee. He's now president and chairman of the board of the Commercial Bank. So actually we had 3 of us from Oklahoma on that one plane.
What's his name in Muskogee?
Bert Bo Baker.
Would you tell me the process of being flown out of the camp?
Okay, well, they just took us by barracks, and we just sort of stood in line as the plane got ready. They would load so many onto, well, they were C-47s, as I recall, and B-17s. There were so many people in that camp that had sworn that I'll never fly again as long as I live. You know, the last mission was a tragedy, and they'd always had a parachute on when they flew. They were just tickled to death to get on that plane without a parachute and fly back home. That just kind of sidelight there. But that's the best I recall. Is just we just stood out there in line, and they just took us so many to a plane, and we'd take off down the runway and bring us back to the area. We had to be deloused, you know, there at Rims, and I think we were flown out of there from Rims, that airfield in Rims, to Lucky Strike where we were. Now I've been back since that time, a couple 3 years ago, went back into Austria to look. I still want to find the tree where I came down and landed. But the best I can recall, the name of the village was Kernhof, where I landed. And I looked, before I went to Europe, I looked all over the map of Austria, and I could not find, and I don't know where I picked up this name, Kernhof, but it just stuck in the back of my mind. And anyhow, as we traveled, rented a car from St. Polten, no, from Vienna, and came east. On the east route there was an Autobahn going down to Graz. And along the way, I found a little town there that looked like it might have been the one. It was on a Saturday afternoon, and nobody spoke English in that town. And I was sitting in this little tavern and making myself known. I said, "Kriegsgefangenen," and oh yeah, and he called up the English teacher there at the local high school and told him he had a former Kriegsgefangenen there, and he wanted to talk to somebody, and I talked to this guy, and he had been an ME-109 pilot during World War II. And I said, "You son of a bitch, you might have been the one that shot me down." and he laughed. He said, "Well, I've got a plane out there at the airport, so I'd be glad to take you up for a ride." I said, "No, you had your chance with me. I don't believe I'll go for that."
So you ever find out?
No. We stayed all night in Graz at a very nice old hotel there in Graz that evening. And I had my whole family, well, my two daughters with me, and my wife, and we were just having a relaxing evening meal, and we were laughing because my daughter had wanted, you know, they serve you a Coke, you got one cube of ice in it, and she kept saying mere ice until they brought her a great big salad bowl filled up with ice cubes in there. I think it was all the ice they had, maybe, and we laughed about that and just joking there. And you never know who's speaking English and who's not around you. But this particular man right over here on the left, at the table next to us, when he got up, he was obviously German, but he said, "Do you people always have this much fun at your meals?" And we said, "No, but this was a particularly festive occasion for us." And I told him all about this, and he says, "Well, I happen to have been a anti-aircraft gunner in this area during." I said, "You might have been the one that," and he laughed. He'd been to the United States a couple, 3 times. but he was very, very nice to us there. But on the way back, we took the west road back towards Vienna. And as I hit the Autobahn, the main Autobahn, I looked down there, and to the west of that, about 6 or 8 miles over there, was a town called Kernhof, which showed we must have been way off our course to the west, way to the west of Germany and Vienna, of Graz and Vienna. And so I made up my mind then we couldn't stop and go back there, but I want to go back. I can recall that little old beer tavern there in the hills. I'll bet it's still sitting back there. It couldn't have been too much built up around there. I want to go back and find it.
From Reims, where'd you go?
We went from Reims to Camp Lucky Strike, and at Camp Lucky Strike was kind of crowded, and they were trying to get people back as fast as they could on ships, and so they offered us an opportunity to have 10 days in Paris or 10 days in London, and so we decided we would. I decided that I could speak English better than I could French, and I could make more points in London than I could in Paris. I'd spend my time in London, and went over there and had a good time. And I had a chance to go up to Edinburgh. I had a free trip up there, but I was busy making the rounds of London, having a ball. But then we shipped out of Liverpool back on the Argentina, the USS Argentina, and came back, landed at Norfolk. And
what's the first thing you did when you hit the States?
Boy, I don't know. Kiss the ground, I think. As best I can recall. And we got off that gangplank, kissed the ground, and we put on a train and went by a train from Norfolk to Fort Smith. And I got in here on the 4th of July. And boy, the firecrackers going off like scared me to death.
And when did you get your discharge?
Was supposed to I had 30-day leave, and then I got 30-day extension. I was supposed to go down for R&R down Miami Beach, and by that time the war was over in Japan, so they changed my orders and told me to go to San Antonio, report back to San Antonio for discharge. And I got back down in San Antonio for around the 1st of October, I guess, when I finally wound up down there. And I had a Class B pass. The second weekend in October is always the OU Texas football game. I hitchhiked from San Antonio up to Dallas to see the OU Texas football game. Ran across a bunch of people from Holdenville. They wanted me to come on home with them. We were just waiting around for discharge, and it was going to be a little while anyhow. I came on, had a friend with me from Iowa. Came on up here, and he was going to go up to Iowa, pick up his car, and drive back down through. We'd go back down to San Antonio and get discharged. You know, that son of a gun was gone 2 weeks before he got back. There we were practically AWOL during that time. Well, it was really with them. The war was over, and if you wanted your discharge, you'd be there, and you're not. If you weren't, well, you'd pick it up sometime later on. They'd call your name the next day. But the very next day, after we got back down to the base, they called my name, and that was on the 31st of October, I believe. I was discharged.
And 45.
45.
That's the Texas OU game, 45. Who won?
You know, I couldn't tell you. I had a good time. I know all these people from Holdenville there. They were feeding me drinks. If we were off camera, I'd tell you a good story about what happened there.
Let me turn this off.
All right. This is
Okay.
It show you just exactly what you were thinking about at that time. Of course, I wasn't married when I went into the service, and we'd been in the PW camp all that time. I got on the trolley there in Dallas. They had a streetcar that took you right out to the Cotton Bowl from the Adolphus Hotel there in Dallas. And everybody was packed. Everybody was facing the front, but I was one of the last ones to get on, and I got up in the front of the streetcar, and I was facing the back. This good-looking blonde was in front of me, and we were just like this, packed into that streetcar. As we'd go down the track, we'd rub, bumped. I was sitting there, and I felt it coming up on me, you know, and there wasn't anything I could do. I moved, tried to get out. Oh, I turned my head and I'd whistle. I couldn't face that gal. She felt it, I know. She couldn't help it. Talk about life's embarrassing moments.
Okay. There. Well, after the Army, you say you got your degree?
Yes, I went back from, went over to Oklahoma University to see about enrolling the second semester, and like I told you, the dean of the law school said, well, maybe you better check and see whether you really want to study or not, and see whether you're ready for law school. And I had enough hours to get into law school at the time, but just wanted to see how I'd do, and I made good grades and let me into law school, and we went summer and clear around the clock until graduated in 48. And I came right back to Holdenville and set up my law practice. Holdenville. Married in 49.
49. What's your wife's name?
Sarah Jane.
What was her name?
She was from Stillwater. I met her at a conclave, fraternity conclave in Stillwater. In fact, I'd been dating a sorority sister of hers, and she'd gotten sick, and I was supposed to be in Stillwater on that weekend, and she asked if she could get somebody to substitute for her because she's going to have to go home and go to the doctor. And I met her that way, and I never dated the other girl since.
And was her name Barry?
Yeah, it was Sarah Jane Berry of Stillwater. Her father was Lieutenant Governor James E. Berry.
Okay, and what year did you take the bar exam?
I took it in 1948, in July of 48.
Was it rough?
Oh boy, that was the toughest examination I had ever gone through, I believe, at that time. I wasn't one of those cum laude students or anything. You know, they have a scale in law school. If you make A's, you make professors. If you make B's, you make judges. If you make C's, you make lawyers. If you make D's, you make money. So I fit in there someplace, I don't know where.
Well, anything else about your time in the prison camps that any particular events or?
I overlooked a story or two. I remember one fellow from Medford, Massachusetts one time. No, he was from New Jersey. He's a Jerseyite, making a statement, just standing there and shaking his head, and he said, you know, there ain't no justice. And I said, what do you mean there ain't no justice? He said, well, when I got in this man's army, the judge told me, he said, you're either going to have to go to the army or you go to jail. He says, here I am in the army and in jail too. There just ain't no justice.
Do you ever reflect back in general?
Oh, I think so. It causes you to maybe have a concern like I was saying earlier today to you, for living for today and protecting your life today, and you wonder, like, what if this were true? If I were killed, what would I? Why am I left here on earth and these other boys were taken? I've been given 40 years of 3 years of reprieve right now that are just extra added years to what might have been my life. And you just hope, really, I think the person that's been in combat feels a very sincere, deep appreciation of his country, and you see how those people live over there, and you just hope it never happens to the people of our country, or that they never are faced with a situation like that. And that's why I am such a communist hater. I believe we can live side by side with communism, but I don't want to live side by side with them. I don't want them in my back door, because they're always a threat. We have trouble enough keeping our borders free of the people that cross the rivers and come in now and are not actually welcomed to our country. We just don't know what kind of people we're getting when they come in like that. And I feel that if we can stop communism in Panama and Nicaragua, it's much better than stopping them in Mexico, or letting them settle in Mexico with missiles pointed towards every city in the United States. I'm sure that a lot of people are aware of that, but not maybe as deeply as the people who've been out of the fire. But one story I want to tell you, and for the benefit of who all might be watching or listening to this, and I think it gives us a moral. I was particularly noticed a young man who was in my room, who was almost what you would have called in World War I shell-shocked. His nerves were just at a brittle edge. You could literally drop a pin and he'd jump. He had a scar here, where he had been jabbed in the face with a pitchfork. He had a scar here where he had been hit across the face with a scythe. He had a scar here where he had been smashed over the head with a shovel. He had been shot down over Budapest and landed on the airfield that he was bombing. And he was so jumpy that I had to ask him one day, I said, "Don't you have a terrific hatred for those people?" He said, "Hate them? No, I don't hate them. In fact, I don't know that I blame them." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was taken to a hospital there in Budapest, and every morning they'd bring in a little, see, I'd be jarred out of my bed at night by the bombs, and they would bring in the next morning a little blonde-headed boy that you knew would grow up someday, might be a football player if he only had 2 legs. And then, you know, the next morning they'd bring in a little blonde-headed girl that you knew her eyes would be blue if she only had 2 eyes. And he said, you know, so those people probably would have rather lived under the hell of Hitler than to see that happen from the American bombs to their children. And he said it's going to take generations for them to ever forgive us for what all was brought about on them. You know, he's got a point.
Okay. That's right. I can't think of anything else.
Well, I really didn't get out my memoirs and prepare for this like I should have probably, but I do this as I recall it from time to time, and you know, with age, the stories get bigger and not necessarily any more accurate than they really were, but I just feel like I'm lucky to even be alive, because the good Lord was looking after me and saw me out of that airplane, snapped that cord when I maybe panicked and could have been drugged down along with the airplane into that crash that it made. By the way, my tail gunner that I mentioned was the story that comes to my mind on that, and the mothers who might listen to this or see it will see what a little good intention by my mother did, and what happened as a result. And I don't know who's at fault on this, but when we were in Topeka, Kansas, and picked up our new plane, the crew went down to my parents came to visit us, and knowing that we were going overseas from there, and when we were taking them to the train to send them back home, we were leaving the next day. Orville Smith was there with me in the train, and as my mother and dad said goodbye to us, she said to Smitty, she says, "Take care of my boy." And Smitty was the boy that was standing in the tail of the plane waiting for me to get out before he bailed out. He never was heard from after that. He was hurt. It looked to me like when he was bending over, all he had to do was crawl out and bail out. But his body was found buried in Belgium. So we don't know what happened to him. I do know that when we were brought back to the United States, I went back up to the little town of Lemon, South Dakota, and it was on Memorial Day. Asked his parents if I could go out and see the grave, and they told me where it was, and I went out there and cried like a baby. Just good friends, good buddies.
Well, sir, thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. Glad to do water allowance, and that had all accumulated there. Then we were shot down before we ever got any R&R, and somebody had a good time with our liquor allowance, but we were always thinking positive, you know.
Kenneth Beckwith lives in Balco, Oklahoma, in the Panhandle. And he was shot down August 13th.
August 13th.
1944.
You know what camp was he taken to?
B-24, and he was at Blue Stalag 4.
Stalag 4. That was right there where we were. And you see this book right here that this fella sent me. I'm sure the Shoe Leather Express refers to the march, and I just got it yesterday, so I haven't been able to read it. I'm sure it refers to the march that they made after leaving Stalag 4, moving south.
Mr. Beckwith said that when they were marched out of Stalag 4, he said that there were 11,000 prisoners marching west with German guards, and he said we marched 10 miles a day for 80 days back and forth between the American and Russian lines. And he said, finally it got down to just a couple hundred in his group, and he said, but they were marched back and forth every day to either escape the Russians or the Americans, back and forth. And so it was, he said how many miles they marched.
2 miles a day. But you can imagine what the conditions they had to live under marching in the dead of winter, and I saw it get down to 40 below zero. That's when I knew, I figured out when centigrade and Fahrenheit coincide.
That's right. Oh, he said it's funny now. He said that 2 American majors drove up, and he told the German guards to get them on the march west. And he said that they came to the Elbe River, and there's an American MP directing traffic. And he said it was, they broke and ran. And he said there were about 6 groups, and he said there were about 3,000 POWs there. And everybody had to stop and pat that MP on the back, and like to beat that poor kid to death. He said every one of them.
Yeah, you bet. Let's get land. And the right engine itself was completely aflame, burning like mad. And as it got about 50 to 100 feet above the runway, the whole thing fell out and hit on the runway. Well, you can imagine well, you being a pilot yourself, what that would do to for the pilot to have to adjust. And that pilot grabbed that plane, had it completely under control all the time, landed it, did a ground loop, and I don't know whether you realize how close the propellers are to the fuselage of the plane, but that pilot, well, the other propeller was still turning when he jumped out of that plane and hit the ground from his pilot compartment there, and it had to be between that propeller and the fuselage.
That was
and he hit the ground running, and sure enough, they got it all taken care of.
That was in Algiers?
This is in Algiers. I almost got killed in taking off the runway out of West Palm Beach. We were in that brand new plane, and it just filled her wing tanks for the first time with sufficient fuel to get us down to Trinidad. And we had gotten 1 minute on course, and I had, as radio man, had already sat down and let out my trailing wire antenna just to test and see if the radio was working and everything in good shape. And I looked back in the bomb bay doors, and there was gasoline pouring down in the bomb bay, about as thick as my thumb, a stream of it flowing down out of the wings down. See, it had a Davis wing. Your wing was up here. And looked out on the right side, and there was gasoline flowing off the wings. And off the left side, gasoline flowing off the wings. And I said, "They're crying out loud to the pilot, get this thing back in as quick as possible, turn off all the electrical equipment." And we shut her off, and he did radio in for a straight-in approach, emergency landing. We came back in there, looked out on both sides. There was ambulances, meat wagons, and fire wagons, all we could see coming down there. And the static electricity didn't get us because I think I forgot to roll in my trailing wire antenna. It was back here, and it grounded the plane way back there behind the plane there. And there's no sparks to set off. You know, on takeoff and landing, that's when static electricity is most apt to get you.
Oh yeah, that's whenever we feel the helicopters. You know, you have that blade turning up there, and of course you have to ground the aircraft, and that is the number one rule. You don't do anything until you ground that aircraft, because all the static electricity builds up to that prop up there. And even then, with that, we've had some incidents happen.
Oh yeah. I don't know how many times in training that aircraft blew up on takeoff. That was the worst thing about the B-24.
Well, I guess.
They just got mail from home.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy, his hometown was where they had a German PW camp. And he was reading along. He was, oh no! No! What's wrong? Oh, said, you should listen to this. Said, my mother said, I just got through baking a cake, which I'm taking out to the German PW camp. Said, I'm sure the German mothers are doing the same for you.
You know, there were quite a few of those camps here in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I just recently saw a map of where they were scattered. But there's one down here around Stringtown, Toka, that worked people all up in this area,
yeah.
even.
Are you a member of the Historical Society?
I have been off and on. I don't know whether I am currently
We
a
had
member.
the Chronicles of Oklahoma, it's been a year or so ago, had an article of the German POW camps in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a map and then had a description of each camp and what was going on. It was an interesting article.
There was an article in the Chronicles of Oklahoma about the time that I was announced killed in action. I've got to send back somewhere.
Yeah, one thing I better do. We're making up a list of all the war dead from Oklahoma using the newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
So I better check if your name may be on there.
Yeah. Who was it? Mark Twain, or the report of my death has been grossly exaggerated.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to ask, what was your parents' reaction when they got the telegram that you were...
I'm glad you mentioned that. I can only tell you what I've garnered from the people of the town here. During that time that I was reported, right after I was reported killed in action, the friends of my dad who were lawyers in town here and the merchants on Main Street said he just looked like, both my mother and father just looked like living dead. They were just wandering around in a state of shock, and they had gone to visit a cousin of mine up in Stroud on this Sunday when the telegram came saying that I was a prisoner of war and having been reported previously killed. And they got in the door, came in the door of the house, and turned on the light, never paid anything attention until one of them looked down and there was a telegram that had been slipped under the door. And they picked it up and they were so relieved they started calling everybody and all the friends. Dad had already collected the insurance, my GI insurance on it, and he was only too happy to give it back to but I've got many letters in the files here someplace. He never threw anything away, and where he had written to, or he wrote to every member or the family of every member of the crew, on a regular basis, trying to find out if they had heard any of the news from any of their boys, and not knowing for sure that these 5 were all dead, and just trying. And for instance, this Shorty Mayer's ex-wife, he was in contact with her. Until finally she said, I'd just appreciate if you wouldn't contact me anymore. I don't want to know anything more about it. And she was still bitter over the divorce, I think, that they'd had.
Okay.